Alright, how's it going today, guys? Today we'll be looking at World War II on the American Homefront. So for the past few weeks, we've been looking at the war in terms of kind of the causes of the war, the impacts of the war on a world stage, look at the major battles, both in the Pacific and the European theaters. Today, again, since we're kind of focusing on the U.S.'s perspective of the war, we're going to be looking at how the war impacted the American economy and just society in general, both during and immediately after the war. So, first things first, you guys are going to have a quick warm-up, so go ahead and do that on your Google Doc. You're going to define these 5 terms: appeasement, neutrality, cash and carry, lend-lease, and the Atlantic Charter. Since we're talking about the economy and the impact of the war on the economy, these terms will kind of help us put that back into context. So hit pause on the video, answer these 5 questions on your Google Doc, and then when you're done with that, go ahead and hit play again. Alright, so once the war started, we kind of see a shift in the American economy in order to kind of gear the economy towards helping the U.S. win the war. If you guys remember, the context of the war really for the U.S. is, well, the Great Depression is still going on. The Great Depression wasn't necessarily ended by the New Deal. It was actually ended by World War II. Because the war created a lot of opportunities for new industries, it created a lot of jobs, a lot of production was necessary. And so, as some historians put it, Dr. New Deal was replaced by Dr. Win the War. And so just like in World War I, although in a much bigger scale, or on a much bigger scale, many civilian industries, companies, factories were converted to produce stuff for the war. And this ranged from airplanes, tanks, guns, supplies, so many things that were needed to win the war. As I've said before, wars are expensive, and so the government had to spend a lot of money to basically produce stuff for the war. Now, the positive impact of this is that the government spending money to build stuff for the war means people get jobs. And essentially, this would kind of resolve the issue of unemployment that was prevalent during the Great Depression. So, along with that, we also did have some, what you could call negative impacts on society as well. Just like in World War I, there's certain goods that were scarce and needed for the war, and so various goods like rubber, fuel, different foods like fats and meat and stuff like that were rationed in order to save them for the war effort. And also price controls were established to kind of give the government more control over the economy. Again, just like in World War I, we have disputes between management and labor. There was a lot of demand for these goods being produced, and so people were being forced to work a lot. People wanted to be paid fairly and be protected from a safety point of view. And so again, just like in World War I, there was a demand for the government to kind of step in and mediate any sort of issues between management and labor. Now, really what enabled the U.S. to win the war is our ability to produce more than the other side. The Axis powers, primarily Germany and Japan, it really underestimated just how much we could produce and how quickly we could produce. Right? We had so many factories that were developed during the kind of boom of American production. Think of like the Gilded Age and the late 1800s, right? All those factories that now were pumping out, motor cars, radios, and all that kind of stuff, that was able to be converted to production for the war. Along with that, new industries emerged as well. As the demand for new weapons and new things in order to help win the war increased, many new industries also emerged following the rise of technology. And the total production of our military goods was nothing sort of astounding. There's a couple of reasons for that. Again, primarily the number of factories, but also new technologies and new ways of how to produce stuff. A good example of this are the Liberty ships. I'll show you a picture here on the left. Basically, Liberty ships were ships that were not very attractive, but they could be built in very, very quick, short amount of time. Before the production of the Liberty ships, it took about 6 months to build a single ship. They got it down to about 42 days with the Liberty ships. Basically, they were making using pre-built panels that they would then rivet together to make the ships. Again, the point wasn't for them to look good, but it was cheap production of ships that were used for transport of goods and troops across the oceans. And then we also have these massive factories like the Willow Run factory, seen here on the right, which up until the building of a new Ford factory, I believe in the late 1940s or 1950s, was the biggest factory in the world. As you can see here, there's just, bombers going down the entire line of the factory. It's a massive, massive factory. It was just pumping out plane after plane after plane. Just like the World War I era had the War Industries Board, World War II had the War Production Board, which essentially did the same thing. It made it sure that the military had all of the resources it needed. It directed the raw materials towards certain factories and companies. It prohibited any non-essential business activities. So in fact, there are very few Ford and other, American cars made during the war, because the government said, hey, we don't need more cars. We need more tanks and planes, so build that instead. It also organized things like scrap drives, where people would kind of recycle their scrap aluminum and other metals and rubber, and then they would use those materials to produce goods for the war. Here's some posters: turn in your scrap, let's make terror rain on the Axis. This picture on the right here, it's Rita Hayworth, who was one of the most popular celebrities of the time, most popular actresses, and she donated her bumper. Many people donated the bumpers off their cars in order to repurpose that metal in order for wartime production. Now, this was very expensive. As I said, wars are expensive. The U.S. spent about $321 billion financing the war, which adjusted for inflation would equal about $3 trillion. So, of course, the national debt increased insanely, right? And we're already doing a lot of deficit spending because of the New Deal. So the government did a few things. Number one is they increased the amount of people that were required to pay income taxes. Before the war, only about 4 million Americans were required to pay income taxes. Only if you're making a certain amount of money, a pretty high amount of money, you were forced to pay income taxes. During the war, they increased, or I guess decreased, the requirements for paying taxes, which led to about 50 million Americans paying income taxes. And this was done to, of course, offset the costs of the war. They also, like in World War I, sold war bonds or liberty bonds in order to kind of sell or raise the money that was necessary. About $185 billion worth of war bonds were sold during the war. And like I said earlier, rationing was also used in order to allocate scarce goods. Meat, butter, sugar, coffee, shoes, all those various things were rationed and limited to how much you could buy per week. Again, like in World War I, people were encouraged to grow their own victory gardens, grow their own food, donate food. There was a stamps and points system, so if you went to the grocery store, you had to give the money to the grocer, as well as the stamp that allowed you to buy the 2 pounds of meat or 2 pounds of butter or whatever. Gasoline rationing was also really difficult to do, but important. And so basically the way they did it was you got a sticker on your car that allowed you to buy gas on certain days. You could only buy gas on those days. And of course, whenever a good becomes scarce, a black market emerges. And so people were finding ways to sell off meat, butter, sugar, gasoline, illegally essentially, in order to make money off of the rationing. Here we see some photos of the ration books and stamps. You'd receive a booklet, seen on the left here, and then you would kind of tear off the individual stamps, and then you would give them to whoever you're buying stuff from, whether that was the gas station or the grocer or the whatever, right, in order to buy the stuff you want. The War Labor Board, like I said, was able to kind of mediate disputes between labor and management during the war. It was made up of people from management, from labor, and from government. Much like in World War I, there was this no strike pledge where various unions agreed to not go on strike as long as they received certain benefits that they were asking for. But there were still some wildcat strikes. This is a very famous photo. Sewell Avery, who was a president of one of the labor unions, supposedly did not comply with the National War Labor Board rulings, and so he was arrested, and he kind of forced the National Guard to carry him like this. It's kind of a famous photo. So what was the overall impact of the war? Well, the GDP, the gross domestic product of the country, more than doubled. Salaries and wages nearly tripled. Employment tripled. Female employment went up by 1/3. Labor unions increased by 50%, while the national debt also ballooned by over 600%. So while the debt increased, ultimately, for the average person, this was a very, very positive thing for the economy. This is what truly broke the Great Depression and got us out of that really dire time period. When we look at the 50s, right, we look at the 1950s in America, which we'll look at in the next coming weeks, that was seen as kind of the golden age of America, right? Think of, Leave It to Beaver, white picket fences, everyone's happy and rich. Obviously not everyone, there were a lot of problems underneath the surface of the 1950s, but it was a very wealthy time period for some Americans, for a good chunk of Americans. And that's because of the war, because of the impacts of the war on the economy, right? We don't have the boom of the 50s without the impact of the war on the economy of the U.S. We see some shifts in the economy as well, geographic shifts. The South started to see some more prosperity, especially with a lot of these huge plants being built in the South because land was cheaper and wages were lower. All right, we start seeing new jobs in different industries like textiles, chemicals, aluminum, right? New resources and new things that are used to make stuff and new ways. Usually when wartime happens, we have new technologies, right? Just like how the radio came from World War II, there are many technologies that came, from World War I. There are many technologies that came from World War II that later on kind of became civilian things, right? The television was kind of developed with World War II technology to a certain degree. Like I said, southern shipyards and aircraft plants grew, and then the West really became the economic powerhouse of the country, whereas before it was the Northeast, it then kind of shifted west and south. California especially, there's some crazy number, I'm blanking off the top of my head, but I think like 10 out of every 15 new companies that were made during the 1940s and 50s were made in California, or something ridiculous along those lines. I gotta double check the exact statistic. But California was just booming with all of the wartime production. Lockheed Martin, various other companies that were built during the war to produce, aircraft and shipyard and ships and stuff like that. The war with Japan was, essentially the focal point of the war for the U.S., and so a lot of stuff shifted west because of that, because of the proximity to the Pacific theater. Alright, so we are done for today. You're going to do two things. So first, you're going to answer these 5 questions on your Google Doc. Number 1 is, about how much did the war cost the U.S. government? How did the federal government raise revenue to pay for the war? Again, go back to the slides to get that answer. What enabled the U.S. to outproduce the Axis powers? Think of the new technologies and kind of strategies that were employed by the U.S. How did the wartime economy impact the average American? Again, look back at the slides. How did the wartime economy impact American workers? And then what effects did the war have in general on the U.S. economy from 1940 to 1945? And then the final thing you're going to do today is you're going to pick one of the following personas and write a letter from their perspective answering why should World War II be remembered. So you can think and look at a variety of things. Okay, so you can look at an American male citizen, African American, Japanese, or white, an American female citizen, African American, Japanese, or white, or an American soldier, choose European or Pacific theater, and kind of think about, why is the war so important, right? Why should we remember it? And based on whose persona you pick or whose point of view you pick, it's going to change, right? For some people it's a positive thing, for some people it's a negative thing, but for almost everyone it was an important thing. And so I want you guys to kind of try to put your minds in that headspace and kind of think about why would the war be important based on who you were. Okay? Alright, so hope you guys enjoyed the lecture, and I will talk to you guys next week. Good luck with the homework.